Sarah Mitchell had always been fascinated by royal traditions. The 24-year-old teacher from Ohio had saved for 3 years to afford her dream trip to London. Walking through the historic gates of Buckingham Palace on that crisp October morning, she felt like she was stepping into a fairy tale. The palace courtyard buzzed with tourists from around the world. Cameras clicked constantly as visitors tried to capture the perfect shot of the iconic red-uniformed guards, standing motionless at their posts. Sarah watched in amazement as these soldiers remained perfectly still, their black bearskin hats towering above their heads, their eyes fixed straight ahead. "They're like living statues," she whispered to herself, pulling out her phone to record a video for her students back home. She had promised her 4th grade class that she would bring back stories of real British guards. As Sarah moved closer to get a better angle, she noticed one particular guard who seemed different from the others. He was younger, probably in his early 20s, with kind eyes that occasionally flickered with what looked like suppressed amusement when tourists tried ridiculous poses nearby. His uniform was pristine, every button polished to perfection, and his rifle was held with practiced precision. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard as more tourists gathered. Sarah found herself studying the guards' incredible discipline. She had read online that these weren't just ceremonial soldiers. They were real military personnel with extensive training. Many had served in combat zones before taking on this prestigious posting. A group of teenagers nearby were making silly faces and gestures, trying to make the guards react. Sarah felt embarrassed for them. These soldiers deserved respect, not ridicule. She watched as the young guard she had noticed earlier maintained his composure despite the increasingly obnoxious behavior around him. An elderly British man standing next to Sarah shook his head disapprovingly. "Shame how some people treat our guards," he muttered. "These lads have earned the right to dignity." Sarah nodded in agreement. She decided to position herself at a respectful distance and simply observe. There was something mesmerizing about their unwavering focus. She wondered what they thought about during their long shifts, standing in all weather conditions while crowds of strangers gawked at them. As the morning progressed, Sarah noticed small details that others missed. The slight adjustment of weight from one foot to another every few minutes. The almost imperceptible deepening of breath when the wind picked up. These guards were human beings doing an incredibly challenging job, not museum pieces for entertainment. The crowd around the young guard grew larger. A family with small children approached, and Sarah watched as the parents taught their kids to stand quietly and show respect. The contrast between these well-mannered visitors and the earlier group of teenagers was striking. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from her sister back home. "Having fun with the robot soldiers?" She smiled at the text but felt a growing appreciation for what these guards endured daily. They weren't robots at all. They were dedicated professionals, maintaining centuries of tradition while dealing with constant public scrutiny. The guard she had been, observing subtly, shifted his gaze for just a moment, scanning the crowd with trained awareness. Sarah realized these soldiers were constantly alert, even while appearing motionless. Their job required both physical endurance and mental sharpness. As noon approached, more tourists arrived for the changing of the guard ceremony. The anticipation in the air was palpable. Sarah checked her watch and realized she had been standing there for over an hour, completely absorbed in watching these remarkable individuals perform their duty. She thought about her students and how she would explain this experience to them. How could she make them understand the dedication and discipline required to stand perfectly still, while hundreds of people stared, photographed, and sometimes mocked you? It was a level of self-control that most adults couldn't maintain for even a few minutes. The young guard remained absolutely motionless, but Sarah had begun to notice the tiny signs of his humanity, the occasional blink that lasted just a fraction longer than necessary, the slight tension in his jaw when someone got too close, the almost invisible straightening of his shoulders when he heard approaching footsteps. Other tourists came and went, snapping quick photos before moving on to the next attraction. But Sarah found herself rooted to the spot, developing a deep respect for these guardians of tradition. She began to understand that what she was witnessing wasn't just a tourist spectacle. It was a living piece of history, maintained by real people with real feelings and real dedication to their duty. The changing of the guard ceremony was about to begin, and the atmosphere in the courtyard shifted dramatically. What had been casual tourist chatter now became hushed excitement as everyone prepared their cameras for the famous spectacle. Sarah positioned herself where she could see both the incoming and outgoing guards clearly. The sound of marching feet echoed off the palace walls as the new guards approached in perfect formation. Their synchronized steps created a rhythmic beat that seemed to make everyone's hearts race a little faster. Sarah had seen videos of this ceremony online, but experiencing it in person was completely different. The precision was breathtaking. As the new guards took their positions, Sarah noticed something unexpected. The young guard she had been watching seemed to hesitate for just a split second before beginning his march to the exit position. It was so brief that probably no one else noticed, but Sarah had been studying him so intently that she caught the tiny moment of uncertainty. During the formal handover process, something went wrong. The young guard's rifle, which should have moved in perfect synchronization with his partner's, was slightly off timing. To most observers, it looked like part of the choreographed ceremony, but Sarah could tell from the tightness around his eyes that he knew he had made an error. Military ceremonies like this required absolute precision. Every movement was practiced thousands of times until it became second nature. For a guard to make even the smallest mistake during such a public display was both embarrassing and potentially serious for his career. Sarah watched as the ceremony continued flawlessly from the outside perspective, but she could see the young guard's internal struggle. His face remained completely neutral, his posture perfect, but there was something in his bearing that suggested he was disappointed in himself. After the ceremony concluded and the new guards had taken their positions, Sarah noticed a senior officer speaking quietly with the young guard who had made the error. The conversation lasted only seconds, but she could see the guard's jaw tighten slightly as he received what was clearly a correction or reprimand. The tourists began to disperse, satisfied with their photos and videos of the famous ceremony. But Sarah lingered, watching as the young guard was escorted to a less visible position away from the main tourist area. She realized he was being moved because of his mistake, a consequence that would affect the rest of his shift. From her new vantage point, Sarah could see the guard clearly but was much closer than she had been before. She noticed details she had missed earlier, the slight tremor in his hands that suggested nervousness, the way he blinked more frequently when he thought no one was watching, and the almost imperceptible slump in his shoulders when he thought he was unobserved. A maintenance worker approached the guard's position to adjust a nearby rope barrier. As he worked, he spoke quietly to the guard in what appeared to be a friendly, supportive manner. Sarah couldn't hear the words, but she could see the guard's posture straighten slightly as if the brief human contact had given him encouragement. The afternoon sun grew warmer, and Sarah noticed the guard beginning to show signs of physical strain. Standing motionless in heavy wool uniforms under the sun was clearly exhausting work. Small beads of sweat appeared on his forehead, but he couldn't wipe them away. His breathing became slightly more labored, though he fought to keep it controlled and silent. A group of tourists approached the guard's new position, led by a loud American man who seemed to think volume equaled importance. "Hey there, soldier boy," he shouted, despite being only a few feet away. "How about a smile for the camera?" Sarah cringed at the man's behavior. The guard, of course, remained motionless and silent, but she could see a muscle in his cheek twitch slightly. The man continued his obnoxious behavior, making increasingly ridiculous demands for the guard's attention while his family looked embarrassed behind him. "Come on, just one little reaction," the man persisted, pulling out his phone and holding it inches from the guard's face. "My friends back home won't believe how serious you guys are." The guard's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, but Sarah noticed his hands tightening almost imperceptibly on his rifle. The strain of maintaining composure in the face of such disrespectful treatment was clearly taking its toll. She found herself feeling genuinely angry on the guard's behalf. Finally, a palace security officer approached and politely but firmly asked the obnoxious tourist to step back and show proper respect. The man complained loudly about uptight Brits but eventually moved on with his embarrassed family trailing behind him. In the quiet moment that followed, Sarah saw the guard's shoulders relax just slightly, as if he had been holding his breath throughout the entire encounter. The relief was subtle but unmistakable to someone who had been watching him as closely as she had been. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah began to understand the true nature of what these guards endured. It wasn't just standing still. It was maintaining dignity and composure while being treated as objects of entertainment by people who often showed no respect for their service or sacrifice. As the afternoon progressed, Sarah found herself becoming emotionally invested in the young guard's well-being. She had been watching him for hours now, and what had started as tourist curiosity had evolved into genuine concern for another human being who was clearly struggling with a difficult day. The guard's position was in direct sunlight, and the heavy wool uniform and tall bearskin hat were obviously causing him discomfort. Sarah could see small drops of sweat running down his face, but he remained perfectly still, unable to wipe them away or seek shade. His breathing had become more controlled, suggesting he was working hard to manage the physical stress. A school group of young children approached with their teacher, who was doing an excellent job of explaining the guard's role and importance. "These soldiers protect very important people," she told her students quietly. "They're real heroes who deserve our respect and quiet observation." Sarah smiled as she watched the children's wide-eyed fascination. Unlike many adult tourists, they seemed to instinctively understand the solemnity of what they were witnessing. They stood in a neat line, whispering their questions to their teacher instead of shouting at the guard. One little girl, probably about 6 years old, stepped slightly forward from the group. She looked up at the tall guard with obvious admiration and very quietly said, "Thank you for protecting the Queen." Though the guard couldn't respond, Sarah thought she saw the tiniest softening around his eyes. But as the school group moved on, they were replaced by a more problematic visitor. A young woman, probably in her 20s, approached with a selfie stick and an attitude that immediately set Sarah on edge. She was clearly intoxicated and looking for social media content that would get attention. "Oh my God, this is perfect," the woman announced loudly, positioning herself right in front of the guard. "My followers are going to love this," she began, posing dramatically, making exaggerated faces and gestures while her phone recorded video after video. The guard maintained his stoic pose, but Sarah could see the tension building in his jaw and around his eyes. This wasn't just casual tourist behavior. This woman was treating him like a prop in her personal entertainment show. "Come on, give me something to work with," the woman demanded, moving even closer. "Just a tiny little smile, a wink, anything?" When the guard didn't respond, she became more aggressive in her attempts to get a reaction. Sarah watched in growing alarm as the woman began to cross obvious boundaries. She waved her hands directly in front of the guard's face, made loud noises near his ear, and even pretended to trip and fall against him. The guard's training kicked in and he adjusted his stance slightly to maintain balance without breaking protocol, but Sarah could see he was reaching his limit. Other tourists had stopped to watch the spectacle, some laughing and recording the woman's antics on their own phones. Sarah felt sick watching how quickly the situation had turned from respectful observation to public humiliation of a person who couldn't defend himself. The woman, emboldened by her growing audience, decided to escalate her performance. "I bet I can make him laugh," she announced loudly. "Watch this." She began making increasingly ridiculous faces and gestures, treating the entire situation like a comedy show. Sarah looked around desperately for a security officer, but none were immediately visible. She realized that someone needed to intervene, but she felt paralyzed by her own uncertainty about what to do. She was just a tourist herself, with no authority or right to tell someone else how to behave. The guard's breathing had become more controlled but also more forced. Sarah could see him working hard to maintain his composure as the woman's behavior became more outrageous. His hands gripped his rifle with slightly more tension, and a small muscle in his cheek twitched periodically. Then the woman made a decision that changed everything. "I know what will get a reaction," she said with a cruel smile. "I'm going to touch him. They're not allowed to move, right? This will be hilarious." Sarah's heart began racing as she realized what was about to happen. She knew that touching a royal guard was absolutely forbidden and could have serious consequences for both the tourist and potentially for the guard himself if he was forced to break protocol to defend himself. The woman reached out her hand slowly, clearly enjoying the anticipation she was creating among her audience. Several people had their phones ready to record what they expected would be a funny moment. But Sarah knew this wasn't going to be funny at all. It was going to be a disaster. In that moment, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't stand by and watch this humiliation continue. Despite her natural shyness and her uncertainty about the consequences, she knew she had to act. The guard was a human being who deserved dignity and protection, even if he couldn't protect himself. Taking a deep breath and summoning courage she didn't know she possessed, Sarah stepped forward just as the woman's hand was about to make contact with the guard's uniform. What happened next would surprise everyone, including Sarah herself. "Excuse me," Sarah called out firmly, her voice carrying across the courtyard with surprising authority. "You need to step back immediately." The intoxicated woman froze with her hand still extended toward the guard, clearly surprised by the interruption. The crowd of onlookers turned to stare at Sarah, who suddenly felt every eye in the vicinity focused on her. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to continue. "Touching a royal guard is illegal," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You could be arrested, and you're putting him in an impossible situation." She stepped closer, positioning herself between the woman and the guard, the woman's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Mind your own business," she snapped. "It's just a stupid tourist thing. Everyone does it." But her hand had dropped to her side and Sarah could see uncertainty creeping into her aggressive demeanor. "No, they don't," Sarah replied calmly. "Most people show respect. This man is a real soldier who has served his country. He deserves better than being treated like a circus act." Her words carried clearly in the now quiet courtyard, and Sarah noticed several other tourists nodding in agreement. An elderly British couple stepped forward to support Sarah. "The young lady is absolutely right," the man said with authority. "This behavior is disgraceful. These guards have earned our respect, not our ridicule." The woman looked around and realized that the crowd's mood had shifted against her. What had seemed like entertainment moments before now felt uncomfortable and inappropriate. Several people had lowered their phones, no longer eager to record what they were beginning to understand was harassment. "Whatever," the woman muttered, but she took several steps back from the guard. "You people are no fun." She gathered her belongings with exaggerated annoyance, but Sarah could see she was actually relieved to have an excuse to end her performance. As the woman walked away, still grumbling about uptight tourists, Sarah remained standing near the guard, her heart still racing from the confrontation. She hadn't planned to make a scene, but she couldn't regret standing up for someone who couldn't defend himself. The crowd began to disperse, with many people approaching Sarah to thank her for her intervention. "That was very brave," said a woman with a Canadian accent. "I was hoping someone would say something." "We should have spoken up sooner," admitted a man with his teenage daughter. "Thank you for having the courage we didn't show." But Sarah's attention was focused on the guard. Though he hadn't moved or acknowledged what had happened, she thought she could see something different in his posture. The tension that had been building in his shoulders seemed to have eased slightly, and his breathing appeared more natural. A palace security officer approached, having been alerted by other staff members who had witnessed the incident. "Thank you for your assistance," he said quietly to Sarah. "That woman's behavior was completely unacceptable, and your intervention was very much appreciated." "Is he okay?" Sarah asked, nodding toward the guard. "She was harassing him for quite a while before I spoke up. I should have acted sooner." The security officer smiled. "These guards are trained to handle difficult situations, but that doesn't mean they don't appreciate support from respectful visitors. You did exactly the right thing at exactly the right time." As the security officer moved on to continue his rounds, Sarah found herself alone near the guard again. The afternoon was growing late, and the number of tourists had decreased significantly. The harsh sunlight had softened into the golden glow of early evening. For the first time since the incident, Sarah really looked at the guard's face. What she saw there made her breath catch slightly. Though he remained perfectly still and professional, there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. A warmth, perhaps, or a subtle acknowledgement of what had transpired. Sarah realized that in defending him, she had also revealed something about herself. She had always considered herself quiet and non-confrontational, someone who avoided conflict and preferred to blend into the background. But when faced with clear injustice, she had found a voice she didn't know she possessed. The guard's shift would be ending soon, and Sarah knew she would probably never see him again. But the experience had changed something fundamental in how she viewed both herself and the importance of standing up for others, even when it felt scary or uncomfortable. As she prepared to leave the palace grounds, Sarah took one last look at the young guard who had unknowingly taught her so much about dignity, duty, and personal courage. She wanted to say something, to somehow let him know that his example had inspired her own moment of bravery. Instead, she simply stood quietly for a moment, showing the same respectful observation she had wished others would demonstrate. But as she turned to walk away, something unexpected happened that would make this day unforgettable for both of them. As Sarah turned to leave, she heard a voice behind her that was barely above a whisper but unmistakably real. "Thank you." She froze mid-step, her heart stopping for a moment. Had she imagined it? Royal guards weren't supposed to speak while on duty. Everyone knew that. But when she slowly turned back, she saw the guard's eyes had shifted slightly to meet hers for just a brief second before returning to their fixed forward position. The courtyard was nearly empty now, with only a few distant tourists who couldn't have heard anything. Sarah stood still, processing what had just happened. The guard had broken protocol, risked his career, to acknowledge her intervention. The weight of that realization hit her like a physical force. She looked around quickly to make sure no officers or supervisors were nearby who might have witnessed the guard's momentary break in protocol. The area was clear, but Sarah knew that security cameras were everywhere around the palace. Had the brief exchange been recorded? Would this young soldier face consequences for his moment of human gratitude? The guard had returned to his perfectly rigid posture, but Sarah could see something different in his bearing now. There was a subtle relaxation, as if expressing his gratitude had relieved some internal pressure he had been carrying throughout the day. Sarah wanted to respond, to somehow let him know that his thanks meant more to her than he could possibly understand. But she also realized that any further interaction could make his situation worse. The best thing she could do for him now was to leave quietly and let him finish his shift without drawing more attention. But before she could take another step, a familiar voice called out across the courtyard. "There she is. That's the woman who ruined my video." Sarah's stomach dropped as she saw the intoxicated woman from earlier, returning with what appeared to be her boyfriend and two other friends. All of them looked angry and determined, and they were walking directly toward her with obvious confrontational intent. "You cost me thousands of views," the woman shouted as she approached. "That video would have gone viral. You had no right to interfere." Her voice was loud enough to attract the attention of the few remaining tourists, who stopped to watch what was clearly becoming a heated confrontation. Sarah felt her earlier courage evaporating as the group surrounded her. There were 4 of them now, all clearly intoxicated and looking for trouble. The boyfriend stepped closer, his voice threatening. "You need to mind your own business, lady. Now apologize to my girlfriend for embarrassing her." "I'm not going to apologize for protecting someone," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady despite her growing fear. "What she was doing was wrong, and you know it." "Wrong?" The woman laughed harshly. "It's just a tourist attraction. These tin soldiers are here for our entertainment." She gestured dismissively toward the guard, who remained motionless but was clearly aware of the escalating situation. The boyfriend moved even closer to Sarah, close enough that she could smell alcohol on his breath. "You're going to apologize right now or we're going to have a problem," he said, his voice low and menacing. Sarah's mind raced. She was alone, facing 4 aggressive people with no security officers immediately visible. The few other tourists in the area seemed unwilling to get involved in what looked like it could turn violent at any moment. But then something extraordinary happened. From behind her, Sarah heard a voice that was clear, authoritative, and completely unexpected. "Step away from the lady. Now." Everyone turned in shock to see the royal guard stepping forward from his position. His rifle held at the ready in a way that suggested he was fully prepared to use it if necessary. His face was stern and professional, but his eyes burned with controlled intensity. "You can't do that," the woman shrieked. "You're supposed to stand still." "You're not allowed to move." "I'm allowed to protect civilians from threats," the guard replied calmly, his voice carrying the authority of his military training. "And you are now presenting a clear threat. I suggest you leave immediately before palace security arrives." The boyfriend, who had seemed so aggressive moments before, suddenly looked much less confident when faced with a trained soldier holding a rifle. "We weren't threatening anyone," he muttered, but he had already taken several steps backward. Your behavior suggests otherwise, the guard replied. You have 10 seconds to clear this area before I call for backup and have you arrested for harassment and potential assault. The group looked around nervously, suddenly realizing that their confrontation with a tourist had escalated into a face-off with armed military personnel. The palace cameras had certainly recorded everything, and causing trouble with royal guards would likely result in serious legal consequences. This is ridiculous, the woman said, but she was already backing away. Come on, let's get out of here. This place is full of crazy people. As the group hurried away, muttering complaints and threats, the guard maintained his defensive position until they were completely out of sight. Only then did he turn to Sarah, his expression softening slightly. Are you hurt? He asked quietly, his concern genuine and immediate. Sarah shook her head, still stunned by what had just happened. I'm fine, but you left your post. You could get in serious trouble for this. The guard smiled slightly, and for the first time all day he looked like the young man he actually was, rather than the perfect soldier he was trained to be. Some things are more important than protocol, he said simply. Before either of them could say another word, the sound of rapid footsteps echoed across the courtyard. 3 palace security officers and a senior military supervisor were approaching quickly, having been alerted by the surveillance system about the guard's departure from his post. Sarah's heart sank as she realized the young guard was about to face serious consequences for protecting her. The military supervisor, a stern-looking man with decades of service evident in his bearing, reached them first. Guardsman Thompson, he said sharply, his voice carrying the authority of rank and experience. Explain why you abandoned your post. The guard Thompson immediately snapped to attention, his expression returning to the stoic mask Sarah had observed all day. Sir, I observed a civilian under threat and took action to protect her safety, sir. That is not your responsibility while on ceremonial duty, the supervisor replied coldly. You know the protocols. Under no circumstances are you to leave your designated position. Sarah couldn't stay silent any longer. Please, sir, this is my fault, she interjected, stepping forward despite her nervousness. Those people were threatening me, and he only intervened when it became clear I was in real danger. The supervisor's sharp gaze shifted to Sarah. Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but this is a military matter. Guardsman Thompson knew the consequences of his actions when he chose to break protocol. One of the security officers stepped forward with a tablet, showing footage from the surveillance cameras. Sir, the recordings show the entire incident. The civilian did defend Guardsman Thompson earlier when tourists were harassing him, and the group that confronted her did appear to be escalating toward physical intimidation. The supervisor watched the footage silently, his expression unreadable. Sarah held her breath, hoping that seeing the full context would make a difference in how Thompson's actions were judged. The woman and her companions had been drinking, another security officer added. We've had reports about their behavior throughout the day. The boyfriend has a history of public disturbances. After what felt like an eternity, the supervisor looked up from the tablet. His expression had softened slightly, but his voice remained stern. Guardsman Thompson, your conduct today has been highly irregular. However, the footage does show that you were protecting a civilian who had previously shown respect for the guard service. Thompson remained at attention, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. His career was hanging in the balance, and they all knew it. Furthermore, the supervisor continued, the recordings show exemplary restraint and professionalism in how you handled the confrontation. You used appropriate force protocols and successfully de-escalated a potentially dangerous situation. Sarah felt a wave of relief beginning to build, but she didn't dare to hope yet. However, the supervisor's voice became stern again. Abandoning your post cannot be overlooked regardless of the circumstances. This incident will be reviewed by the commanding officer, and appropriate disciplinary action will be determined. Thompson's voice was steady as he replied, I understand, sir. I accept full responsibility for my actions. Sarah couldn't bear the thought that this young man might face punishment for protecting her. Sir, please, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. He saved me from what could have been a very dangerous situation. Surely that should count for something. The supervisor studied Sarah for a long moment. Ma'am, may I ask your name and occupation? Sarah Mitchell. I'm a teacher from Ohio. A teacher, the supervisor repeated thoughtfully. And you intervened earlier to protect Guardsman Thompson from harassment. Yes, sir. It was the right thing to do. He couldn't defend himself, so someone else had to. The supervisor nodded slowly. It seems both of you have shown remarkable character today. You protected him when he couldn't protect himself, and he protected you when you needed protection. He turned back to Thompson. Guardsman, while your actions were technically against protocol, they were morally sound and professionally executed. The review board will take all of these factors into consideration. Thank you, sir, Thompson replied, though his expression remained carefully neutral. The supervisor looked between Sarah and Thompson one more time. Ma'am, thank you for showing respect to our guards and for your intervention earlier. It's refreshing to meet tourists who understand that these are real people deserving of dignity. As the security officers began to escort Thompson away for debriefing, he turned back to Sarah one last time. Thank you, he said simply, but his eyes conveyed much more than those two words could express. Sarah watched as he was led away, wondering if she would ever know what happened to him. The supervisor approached her one final time. Miss Mitchell, I want you to know that your actions today were observed and appreciated by more people than you realize. Good character always makes a difference even when we think no one is watching. As the sun set over Buckingham Palace, Sarah walked away knowing that this day had changed both her and Thompson in ways neither of them had expected when the morning began. 3 weeks after returning to Ohio, Sarah was grading papers in her classroom when her principal knocked on the door. Sarah, there's someone here to see you. He says it's about your trip to London. Confused and curious, Sarah followed her principal to the main office, where she found a man in a crisp military uniform waiting with a warm smile. He was older, perhaps in his 50s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Miss Mitchell, I'm Colonel James Harrison from the British Embassy in Washington. I was hoping we could have a word about your recent experience at Buckingham Palace. Sarah's heart raced. Had something gone wrong? Was Thompson in trouble because of what had happened? Is everything all right? The guard who helped me, is he okay? Colonel Harrison's smile widened. Please don't worry. I'm here with very good news. May we sit down? In the privacy of the principal's office, Colonel Harrison explained why he had traveled to Ohio. Miss Mitchell, the incident at Buckingham Palace was thoroughly investigated, as is standard procedure. The security footage and witness statements painted a very clear picture of what transpired. Sarah waited nervously for him to continue. Guardsman Thompson has not only been cleared of any wrongdoing, but he's been commended for his actions. The review board determined that he showed exceptional judgment and courage in protecting a civilian while maintaining professional standards. Relief flooded through Sarah so powerfully that she felt tears forming in her eyes. He's not in trouble? Quite the contrary. He's been recommended for early promotion and has been selected for specialized training that will advance his career significantly. His actions that day demonstrated exactly the kind of character and decision-making ability the military values most highly. Colonel Harrison reached into his briefcase and pulled out an envelope. But that's not the only reason I'm here. Your actions that day have also been recognized officially. Sarah opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was an elegant certificate bearing the Royal Coat of Arms and formal language thanking her for exemplary citizenship and courage in defending the dignity of Her Majesty's Guard. This is incredible, Sarah whispered, staring at the official document. I never expected anything like this. There's more, Colonel Harrison continued, his eyes twinkling with obvious pleasure at her reaction. The Queen herself was briefed on the incident. She was particularly moved by your respect for the guards and your courage in standing up for someone who couldn't defend himself. He pulled out another, smaller envelope. She asked me to personally deliver this to you. With shaking hands, Sarah opened the envelope to find a personal note written on royal letterhead. The message was brief but heartfelt. Miss Mitchell, thank you for reminding us all that true character is shown in how we treat others when we think no one important is watching. Your kindness and courage honor both your country and mine. Elizabeth R. Sarah stared at the note in complete disbelief. The Queen wrote this herself? She did indeed. She was quite impressed by your story and wanted to thank you personally. Colonel Harrison stood to leave but turned back with one final surprise. Oh, and there's something else. Guardsman Thompson, or rather Lance Corporal Thompson now, asked me to give you this. He handed Sarah a small package. Inside was a photo of Thompson in his dress uniform, but this time he was smiling warmly at the camera. On the back he had written, "To Sarah, thank you for showing me that courage comes in many forms. You stood up for a stranger when it mattered most. That kind of bravery is rarer than any medal. With gratitude and respect, James Thompson, Lance Corporal." Also in the package was a small pin bearing the insignia of his regiment. "He wanted you to have this," Colonel Harrison explained. "It belonged to his grandfather, who served in World War II. Thompson said you earned it by showing the same courage his grandfather always talked about. The courage to do what's right even when it's difficult." Sarah held the pin carefully, understanding the significance of such a gift. "This is too much. I just did what anyone should have done." "That's exactly why it means so much," Colonel Harrison replied. "You did what anyone should have done, but most people don't. That's what made your actions extraordinary." After Colonel Harrison left, Sarah sat alone in her classroom, surrounded by the evidence of an ordinary life that had been touched by something extraordinary. The royal certificate hung on her wall next to her teaching credentials, and Thompson's photo sat on her desk where she could see it every day. When her students returned from lunch, they found their teacher in an unusually thoughtful mood. "Miss Mitchell, you look different today," observed Emma, one of her most perceptive students. "Something good happened, didn't it?" Sarah smiled, thinking about how to explain the events of the past few weeks in terms her fourth graders could understand. "I learned something important recently," she said. "Sometimes we have opportunities to help others, and those moments can change everything, not just for them, but for us too." "What kind of helping?" asked Marcus, always eager for stories. "Well," Sarah began, settling into her chair as her students gathered around, "let me tell you about the time I met a real British soldier." As Sarah told her students about respect, courage, and standing up for others, she realized that the most important part of the story wasn't the royal recognition or the personal notes. It was the lesson she had learned about her own capacity for bravery and the ripple effects that simple acts of kindness could create. Months later, Sarah received a letter with a British postmark. Inside was a wedding invitation from James Thompson, who had met his fiancée during his specialized training program. At the bottom of the invitation, he had written, "Your courage that day reminded me that taking risks for the right reasons can lead to the most rewarding outcomes. Thank you for teaching me to be brave." Sarah smiled as she marked the date on her calendar. Some connections, she had learned, transcend continents and circumstances. The young guard who couldn't move had helped her find her voice, and in return, she had helped him find his future. The invitation sat on her desk next to his photo, a reminder that sometimes the most ordinary days can become extraordinary through simple acts of human decency. And every time a student asked about the royal certificate on her wall, Sarah would tell them the story of a day when a teacher from Ohio and a guard from Britain proved that courage is contagious, and kindness always matters, even when you think no one important is watching.